Laura Lahti, who's the impact manager at Camco Clean Energy. Maybe Laura, you can just give a bit of a wave there.
Yes. Hello,
Thank you.
everyone.
She has a long history of working with climate change mitigation projects and related capacity building initiatives in African countries. Originally from Finland, she brings her deep European experience to her work at Camco. Welcome to you, Laura. And then I've got Siddhant Rajpandi, who's the chairman and CEO of Business Oxygen. He also has deep roots, but this time in the banking sector. Siddhant established Nepal's first onshore global private equity fund that has a climate focus. Now with a track record of over 6 years, he has significant experience of investing in an emerging economy. Welcome to you, Siddhant.
Thank you.
I will just say that Laura and Siddhant are based in Johannesburg and Nepal, Kathmandu, Siddhant, if I'm not mistaken, and they may well experience a few power outages this morning or today. If they do, they hope that they will be back online pretty promptly while they switch over to alternative sources. I then have Scott Reinhardt on the line, who's the founder and managing director of Braun Capital. He has some 26 years experience of institutional asset management. Scott launched Braun Capital in 2015 to capitalize on and accelerate the transition to renewables. Glad to have you here, Scott.
Thank you, Dean.
And then finally, I have Tamar Reutemann, who's the executive manager of the Brazilian Biogas Association. She's a chemical engineer by training, and she's helping shape in her role new regulations and promote investments in the Brazilian biogas sector to increase its share of the energy sector in that country. Good to have you here too, Tamar.
Thank you.
Welcome to all of you. What I'd really like to do now is just start getting into the substance of this discussion. So today, about 91% of the world's population inhabits places where air quality fails to meet World Health Organization guidelines. And many of our panelists come from or are currently based in countries that battle specifically with this issue, being Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, Vietnam, and Nepal. And they see the implications of this directly. The COVID-19 pandemic has heightened awareness surrounding the costs of air pollution. And while the global lockdowns have improved air quality, this is only temporary. Air pollution is the world's 4th biggest killer. Man-made air pollution is a global phenomenon and a global killer. And it costs the global economy trillions of dollars every year. Solutions are not easy. Air doesn't stick to a particular geography or thematic area, and it's difficult for investors to focus on it specifically. But there are some practices and areas of investments that make a difference. And some of them include providing universal access to clean and affordable fuels, affordable and clean transport systems, and investing in energy efficient power generation, just to name a few. If you listened to Amit's comments earlier today, you will have heard that at the heart of all of these solutions is the principle of regeneration. Most often it's people at the base of the economic pyramid that are disproportionately affected by climate change, and in this case, the quality of our air. Solutions are often costly and available to those that can afford them. So I'm so glad to have panelists today that have a deep experience of investing in solutions that address some of these issues, and particularly in the geographies that they do. So, in the preparation for this discussion today, I had the joy of talking to all of my panelists beforehand. And I'd like to start off with you, Siddhant, particularly because you've particularly sketched a very stark visual picture of Nepal and its geographic location and the obvious effects of dirty energy on the Himalayas in particular. Would you like to just share a little or paint that picture for us, please?
Yes, thank you, Dean. Nepal is probably one of the least carbon emitting nations in the world, but it is one of the most vulnerable. Now, to put that in perspective, let me tell you that our share of the total global carbon emission is 0.02%, which is negligible. But having said that, in the past 10 years, our carbon footprints has doubled. And that is, we have to be cognizant about that exponential growth. But being in the Hindu Kush region where the Himalayas are, we are very vulnerable to climate change. Unremitting humanitarian infrastructure disasters due to climate change are happening faster and faster each year. Our Himalayan glaciers are melting. Himalayan lakes are about to burst. The snow lines in the Himalayas are receding. Now, this region provides 1.4 billion people with water, clean water, and irrigation. So it is very important that there has to be transformational change. Now, that transformational change, I call it top down as macro and bottom up as micro. Governments need to deal with the region and international players to try to mitigate this disaster. But for players like us, a private equity firm who deals with SME investing, we embed climate smart approaches and ESG measures in our process of investments, so that they are aware that, you know, it is profitable and society benefits from it.
Great. That's and I just, you know, we all understand and know of the Himalayas, even though we haven't been there, and I think it paints a really, really compelling picture as to what we need to do. Scott, do you have some insights in terms of Vietnam specifically? I know Vietnam is not the only country you invest in, but we asked you to talk about that specifically, and particularly their ongoing reliance on coal-based energy.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. For us, our goal is really to try to develop, install, and add as much renewable electricity as we can. So if you look at Vietnam, unfortunately, they're one of but just a handful of countries globally where the CO2 per capita is actually going to be increasing between now and 2050. Right now, they release approximately 1.5 tons per capita, and that's going to increase to over 2.5. And really, that's down to one simple fact: the country's very quickly growing. Even during COVID, the energy demand actually went up 4% year over year. And so from our perspective, they have 21 gigawatts of coal, and that's projected to go up to 37 gigawatts of coal per the government plan. Wow. And more solar that we can put onto the grid, hopefully we can decrease that.
Great. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I'd like to move on to some of the solutions a little bit. Tamar, maybe you can provide a brief overview of biogas without getting too technical, if I may. And particularly, I want you to focus on how it's helpful in the Brazilian context, and how do most vulnerable communities benefit in particular?
Okay, thank you so much, Dean. And I thank you for the opportunity to explain a little bit how does the biogas market work here in Brazil. A biogas, just for me to explain, is an association that represents more than 80 companies. Here in Brazil, biogas is produced only from residues, such as agro-industry residues, animal manure, and residues from the sanitizing, sewage treatment, and landfills. This is really important when we are talking about vulnerability, vulnerable communities. We see that biogas is a way to reduce air pollution and reduce carbon emissions from the sewage treatment and from landfills. Here in Brazil, less than 50% of our municipal solid waste is directed to landfills. Most of our garbage, right, we are put in dumpsters. So the landfills and the production of energy from the landfills is a big advance here. It's not the ideal solution. We hope to have a significant collection and separation of the municipal solid waste, but this is our reality here. So the landfills are a better solution for now than the dumpsters, and the production of biogas is a way to reduce some of this pollution, because when you produce biogas, you want to make the best use of all the gas. So there is high control and high quality of the emissions that are being directed to the air. So this is so biogas is really an important way to reduce pollution, to treat residues here in Brazil, and to generate renewable energy. And we have a huge potential for that. We could replace more than 30% of energy consumption with biogas here.
That's fantastic, Tamar. I was going to make a comment that, you know, biogas is obviously a transition fuel, but you've explained it so beautifully how you're using the residues that you describe so that it actually is a better solution. May not be perfect, but it certainly is part of the journey. Laura, can I turn to you, please, and ask you just to talk a little bit about the renewable solutions that you're investing in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Sure, thank you, Dean. So we invest through our renewable energy performance platform in small and medium-sized renewable energy, both in on and off-grid setup. In terms of technology, this means mainly solar, PV, grid-connected, wind power, as well as run-of-river hydro. And on the off-grid side, it is solar home systems, companies, and mini-grid solar, mini-grids mainly. These are then often combined with appliances that are productive use appliances, or appliances such as pressure cookers in the off-grid sector. Then through our innovative energy efficiency finance platform Spark, we invest in commercial and industrial sector. It is the funding goes through us to rooftop PV, as well as energy efficiency and battery capacity. So those are the main areas.
That's fantastic. Laura, I know that we discussed this when we prepared a little bit for this panel discussion today, that even though you're investing in these solutions, some of them, you know, renewable solar and etc., they sometimes present different challenges from an environmental perspective. And how do you reconcile those differences or those challenges that you might inadvertently introduce as well?
Yes, so as in any infrastructure project, there's always environmental challenges related to, which we obviously manage through environmental social management systems at company and investee level. But specifically, if I think about air quality and the topic we're talking today, comes to my mind our energy efficiency measures where we invest. I mean, in general, in clean technology, there's hazardous materials. But through the Spark Fund, for instance, specific focus needs to be given for a replacement of refrigerants and the use of new refrigerants that have ozone depleting potential. So this would mean obviously ensuring that the investee companies you invest in only apply state-of-art technology. It may sound very kind of a basic rule to go by, but in a lot of the markets where we invest in, even though the countries would be signatories to Montreal Protocol, these products still exist in the market, for instance, in heat pumps. So that would be the first step. And then the second step is the technology that is replaced, again, in the energy efficiency space, ensuring that the equipment is correctly degassed and dispersed.
And you're actually baking those into the investment agreements, is that correct?
Yes, in the investment agreement, so due diligence investment agreement, and we do quite rigorous monitoring. So the investee companies provide quarterly reports where, for instance, hazardous waste materials are something we monitor, and on an annual basis we do a review then where they need to kind of provide a certification that where the hazardous waste has been disposed.
Okay, so much has been talked about in the press in terms of the fact that we really don't have a lot of time left to solve for some of these issues. And so there's a significant race against the clock. Scott, maybe I can turn to you and ask you to tell us how you're in fact actually tackling Vietnam's reliance on fossil fuels one rooftop at a time, and how you're rolling that out and trying to do so as fast as you can.
No, great question. And so for a country that needs to double the energy capacity double it by 2030 and double it again by 2050.
Wow.
We're focused specifically on industrial warehouses and factories, where it's a combination of self-consumption as well as some ability to sell some spill power onto the grid. So there, we think we're tackling two things. One, putting clean energy onto the grid, while at the same time providing much needed capacity at the point of consumption. And so if we can do that, hopefully we can eliminate you know, the ever expanding amount of fossil that's also going into the country at the same time.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's almost an overwhelming challenge to be able to think about doubling and doubling again from that perspective. Is part of the challenge, you know, finding investors that really have interest in these solutions? In other words, some of the supply of capital. I mean, I understand how you making it accessible at the point of consumption, but do investors see it that way? Are you battling to find capital to invest?
Great question. And so the other markets we invest in are more developed, and so we see a real bifurcation with some investors really kind of putting their toe in the water into Asia and preferring Northern Asian exposure, i.e. the developed markets. But then at the other extreme, you know, we are speaking to some investors that all they want is developing Asia. And so we're more than happy to speak to them. But saying that, you know, there is a lot of power that needs to go in, and we would definitely welcome additional conversations if anyone wanted to have those.
Yeah, I know. Siddhant, where do you raise most of your capital from at the moment?
Well, you know, Nepal being a post-conflict frontier nation, it's the DFIs that have the risk capacity to want to invest in these markets. So IFC was the lead investor, and we are a part of their SME Ventures investment worldwide. And our second investment lot was FCDO and climate investment funds. That's why we have a climate focus. But so far in private equity, it's only the DFIs, the European DFIs and the multilaterals and the bilaterals who have had the appetite to enter this market. Now, funds like us, the onus is on us to prove that we are open and profitable in doing this business with an impact, so that we can have mainstream investors and, you know, family wealth managers to also come in. So that's going to take a little bit of time, but it's the DFIs who have that appetite.
Sure. And I mean, you lay out sort of, you know, a post-conflict frontier market very clearly. You know, one of the principles, and I'm just going to segue a little bit into this, is of DFI investment is often to establish a track record so that other investors might see that it's actually not as risky as they perhaps thought, or that the risks can in fact actually be managed. Are you seeing some traction from investors that are not DFIs at the moment, or is that still to come?
That has still to come. But, you know, having said that, we are a DFI investment. We are finance first model. You know, we have to ensure that the IRR is there, especially for a fund manager. That's most important to demonstrate that you can have a profitable fund. And we've demonstrated that, and it's happening. So, but these are still very early years.
Okay, that's good to know. And I mean, I hope that the early years don't last as long as sometimes they do. But maybe I can move on to Laura a little bit. When you were talking to me, and I really wanted to shift a little bit into how we measure and track. You were sharing with me when you were talking about, when we were preparing for this panel, that you were considering how to quantify health benefits into your investments in that due diligence phase, particularly as you measure and track your investments. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how you're going about it?
Yes, so this is a new area for us. GAMCO is a Green Climate Fund accredited entity, and we are currently working to kind of define the synergies between decentralized renewable energy and improving communities' resilience to climate change. And this through this work where the health impacts have also come to a question. So we currently monitor the number of beneficiaries in the off-grid communities. We do obviously quantify the greenhouse gas emission reductions from those projects, but through this resilience work, we helped improving communities' health, assist them in adapting to climate change or being more resilient. We have been thinking of new ways to kind of quantify that. And I think those will be probably most likely in form of customer surveys to the end customer to try to define the quantity of baseline fuel that has been replaced, whether it's kerosene or charcoal, wood use, sorry, and most likely then based on the quantification with help of the CDM methods to kind of quantify the other air pollutants that are there. Potentially one could also include questions around reduction of respiratory diseases to these questionnaires. But this is, as I mentioned, work in progress, so to say.
Okay, and I mean, what makes it particularly challenging from your perspective? I mentioned some challenges in the beginning, but it you know, I may be just assuming from you know, just my own perspective on this. What are some of the challenges that you're dealing with in terms of trying to track things like the health or quality, air quality benefits?
I think it's about data accuracy.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of I think in the impact investing world, a lot of the reporting is about potential impacts. And what we obviously try to do is kind of track down the actual impact that has occurred rather than what we are projecting that fund will realize. So one is around that. Of course, through off-grid companies, what is great is the investee companies have their all of their customers in a database. So kind of accessing that customer database information is easy. One can even receive quite disaggregated data in terms of gender or age. So this is available. Another level going to quantifying the health impact would be then having surveys with the actual customer base, most likely through mobile kind of questionnaire to answer on a few questions. But it would be about data accuracy. Obviously, this can only be done in a sample of customers.
Sure. I love the idea of talking to the end customer at the end of the day, and there's some great solutions that are around at the moment, particularly to talk to people specifically in a very rapid way. So it's wonderful that you're thinking along those lines. Tamar, can I turn to you quickly and just I know that you've outlined the fact that Biogas has a really ambitious agenda in Brazil, and largely to harvest existing waste and to transform it into fuels that can significantly reduce Brazil's reliance on diesel. How do members of your association report on the positive environmental impacts, and maybe some of them that might be negative? Do they track air quality or its health or societal benefits in any way?
Yes, thank you, Dean. As I mentioned before, we have the potential to substitute 30% of electricity consumption, but we also have the potential to substitute 70% of our diesel consumption. This is in where we believe there is a great spot for us is in heavy-duty vehicles that can't be electrified yet, or it will be really difficult to do that. Brazil is really reliant on trucks to go all around the country. So we have a huge consumption of diesel, and transportation is an important source of carbon emissions. And biomethane could have negative carbon footprint. This is we have a program here in Brazil. It's called RenovaBio.
Did I just
similar
lose
to the
yeah.
California low carbon fuel standard. And we, in this program, can you hear me well? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I can hear you.
This
Go
program, such as
Tamar, I'm going to just switch from you for a moment because I think your sound is breaking up a little bit, but I'll come back to you in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So now, can you hear me well now?
It is breaking up a little bit, and I think we've got quite a lot of background noise. So maybe you can just hold on for a second, and I'll come. No, that's okay. I'll come back to you in a minute. Okay.
Okay.
And maybe it'll settle down a little bit. All right. Scott and Siddhant, I know that you're very well versed in tracking the number of solar panels or renewable solutions that you've installed, and the scale of your impact. How are you thinking about some of those changes that might impact over time? So Siddhant, maybe I can start with you. I know you talk about the 6-year track record, which is great, and but can you actually see significant differences from when you first started to now, and how are you tracking that pace of change in particular?
Thank you, Dean. I mean, this is a very challenging question because, besides...
I'm sorry.
No. This is very interesting because, especially in countries like ours, where the industry indexes are not available readily, besides greenhouse emission tracking, we think about tracking changes over time through markers of the ecosystem. The ecosystem markers could include policies, sector business models, etc. For example, we could examine whether an investment has induced policy or is creating pressure on policy change. In most of these changes, it may not be possible to demonstrate a fully quantitative metric for the marker. The best approach is to use anecdotal evidence that is backed by some sort of documentary proof. Now, to give you an example, one of our investee companies, which lobbied the government to introduce net metering in rooftop installations, has been able to bring about policy changes, and now there's a very clear chance that a utility company can be formed in the future because of that for renewable energy. So, and finally, we assess whether the investment is helping to shape a new narrative about the sector or the opportunity, and it's very important that this can be documented by the various policy changes that come from the government, and that is how we look at it as from a successful point of view.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a minute and turn to Scott for a second. I'm also going to, I see some of the questions coming through, and thank you to everyone in the audience for answering them. We will address them soon, but I'm going to put Scott a little bit on the spot. I hope you don't mind, and just introduce one of the questions that have been answered. So again, I know you're tracking a lot of the installations. Laura talked about actually including the end beneficiaries at the in some of those solutions and talking to clients of the solutions. How do you address that in some of your investments?
No, thank you. So like the other participants, we do track the amount of carbon that is reduced from our investments. But in addition to that, we're seeing definitely more of an interest on the tracking side, meaning as we gear up for an Article 8 fund, we will be providing SFDR reporting. And in addition to that, we're also seeing inquiries from some large corporate investors that are seeking really not just the amount of megawatts we're producing, but they want to see an auditable file, meaning so we're engaged with the group to provide blockchain tracking on the back end of the amount of renewable energy that our projects do generate.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the blockchain, because you're using artificial intelligence in some way, is that right? Or if
Correct. And so this is really a way for investors to have an audit trail of the energy that we are generating. And this is really a byproduct of RE100. It's fantastic that organization now has over 300 signatories of corporates globally that are all trying to make a dent, trying to purchase renewable energy, and this tracking piece is critical for that. For them to receive the credits, they need to have an auditable track record on the back end.
And I can see how investors are trying to drive that, and you've referenced some regulation, the pervasive European taxonomy legislation that is requiring funds to report in the way in which you've described. Some of the end users of your, you talked earlier about the point of consumption. How do you involve them in what it is that they may need, and what the solutions that you're providing, how effective they are for the lifestyles that they are wanting and choose to live?
So honestly, the sales process is far, far simpler, meaning it's, the offer is we'll save you 5 to 20% off your utility bill. And oh, by the way, it's green. And so that's why I'm convinced globally we will shift to 100% renewable. Yes, we're saving the world, but it's just cheaper.
Okay.
It's just cheaper.
Yeah, and that often makes, that's just the fundamentals, isn't it?
Agree.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Siddhant, I thought you might wanted to make a comment on that as well. Are you finding those kinds of cost efficiencies too?
Absolutely, and I think what Scott says really drives home, because that is the scenario here as well. Our RESCO, or Renewable Energy Service Company, that's what they do. They install the PVs, and then it's cheaper than buying electricity from the grid. And it's clean energy, and it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Tamar, let me try and come back to you for a second. But obviously in the development of biogas as a transition solution, there's a fair amount of building of infrastructure. Does that lead to a lot of job creation in your context? And do you have are you able to actually share with us a little bit about that specifically?
Yes, of course. And mainly the job creation is in the interior of the country, on rural areas. That is really important here in Brazil. We create quality jobs in areas that are not so much developed. They don't have industries, and the electricity is not so great as well. The distribution of electricity is not good. So this is really important, the use of residues that are produced in the manure, in the pig creation and animal creation, or in the agro industry. So when you produce your own energy, this is what we are talking about here. Solar is a way to produce your own energy, but biogas is also a really great way to produce your own energy supply. So you don't depend on the distribution of electricity. You don't depend on energy that is coming from fossil fuels that are being produced miles and miles away. So this is really interesting, and we are generating, of course, important jobs and quality jobs in these areas.
Okay, fantastic. Tamar, you gave me a wonderful segue into the next question that I want to ask of others on the panel. But most of the literature will tell you that air quality will suggest that some of the solutions really need to be applied into the urban areas in particular. In other words, tackling cities as a major source of pollutants into the air. All of you work in regions of the world that have significantly large cities that really struggle with air quality. Is there a proportion of your investments that is urban focused versus rural focused? Laura, maybe I can start with you.
Yes, thank you. I don't really have a answer to that. In that our Spark, which focuses on the C&I sector, is all urban. Mm-hmm. In urban settings.
Just give me C&I, just break that down for the audience.
Commercial and industrial customers.
Okay,
so these are the rooftop PV solutions, any different kind of energy efficiency measures. Whereas for the renewable energy performance platform, I can give you a on and off grid split. So which we have 44% from the current portfolio is invested to off grid, the rest on grid. However, vast majority of these projects are in rural areas, because renewable energy, if it's not rooftop, it requires space or that river or the wind conditions. So from that perspective, some of the off-grid projects do take place in urban areas and like surroundings of bigger cities, but majority are in rural setting.
Okay, and I mean, you know, I always think of you know, the quality of air so closely linked to economic development as well. Like Tamar, where some of this infrastructure is built in rural areas, does that have a knock-on effect in terms of also creating jobs and livelihoods for people that might not ordinarily have access to those types of jobs as well?
Yes, if I can go. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Tamar, just hold on. I was asking Laura, no problem.
I'm
okay.
really sorry. I'm really sorry.
It's okay.
Yes, so we have a number of KPIs. One of them is job generation. So through the renewable energy performance platform, we have today generated a bit over 7,000 full-time employment direct jobs. And we also track productive use of energy. It's also around 7,000 somewhere there. So there is that impact to the community
that's fantastic. I'm going to switch to some of the questions that are coming through at the moment, and thank you, Grace, for organising them so nicely at this particular point. And then I'll round out with a couple of last questions in terms of learnings to all of you. But one of the questions that has come is really about how does rapidly changing technology affect your investment decisions? You know, if you consider, I mean, Scott, you talked a little bit about how AI can augment your work, but I would also imagine some of the technology changes are also within the solutions that you're actually providing. Is sometimes the automation age also replacing jobs? How do you deal with some of those technology issues? And Scott, as you can gather, I'm going to pick on you if I can.
No, this is a great question. I mean, there is a Moore's law of everything we invest in renewables. I mean, it's, you know, it's like your iPhone. For every doubling of capacity, you have a decrease in cost or increase in efficiency. So, I mean, over the next decade, we expect solar to drop by a further 72%, even though it's already fallen by 82%. Similarly, wind down 43% and batteries down 80%. And so what is already the most efficient, the cheapest source of power is only going to become cheaper.
Okay, and the displacement question in terms of jobs is, you know, we've talked a little bit about some of the creation of jobs amongst other panelists. How's that you know, disconnect sometimes, and some of these solutions also displace jobs? Does that, how are you dealing with that?
Well, in terms of the, you know, we're definitely in hiring mode in regards to, we are working with contractors on a daily basis in regards to putting more projects into operation. I mean, there needs to be about $1 trillion spent each year if we are to go through this energy transition. And so absolutely, I mean, there are going to be winners and losers. There will definitely be a fair share of Kodak moments with some groups that just failed to make the transition. Yeah. And it's coming, and it's coming fast.
Okay. All right. So Dant, maybe I can direct the next question to you. One of the things that you mentioned was really using evidence to back your investment decisions in many ways. Can you elaborate a little bit on this, and how are you finding some of that evidence? Maybe you can talk us through an example of evidence that you've picked up along the way and how that ties back to your investment activities. Did you change some of your investment decisions as a consequence?
Well, as we move, thank you, Dina. As we move forward, I mean, Nepal is in a huge electrification drive. That is, right. It is about to increase its electricity use. But we have clean energy, which is hydropower. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that if there is sustainably electricity being provided without any disruptions, then there could be a pivot from biomass and other oil and diesel or petrol usage, and replacement by electricity. So we have to be ready for the next change. The challenge on accelerating this electrification is the problem of reliability. You see, there are disruptions, intermittent power supply, and the consumer is going to have to normally go through many disruptions. So this can affect the business. So what we're looking at is solar solutions as well as storage systems.
Okay.
Where we're looking at how we can mitigate those disruptions by providing storage in the future. And as Mark mentioned, the cost of batteries are going to come down, storage is going to get cheaper. And, even with disruptions, if that can just automatically set in when disruptions take place, then we are seriously looking at how storage systems, especially during the dry season where electricity is going to be very poorly provided by the supplier, how these storage systems can kick in.
So if I've understood you correctly, the evidence that you have picked up is mainly on the supply of power and the spotty nature of it, and so investing in the storage solutions helps to cover that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. One is that it opens new marketplaces to invest.
Okay.
The other is electric vehicles. Now with good electrical supply, and the government has already started to lower import duties on electric vehicles, this gives us an enormous potential and potential to start investing in those sectors.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to switch to another question now. Is that somebody in the audience is asking for some advice and guidance on the details of measurement frameworks that you might use, any specific measurement or metrics that could be used here that you'd like to share with the audience, practical resources for the audience that they could think about when measuring the impact of their investments, particularly in this area. Lara, I know that this is a very strong area of yours, so I'm going to ask you to maybe kick off and then others can jump in as well.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So we have our own measurement method in that sense, which is aligned with the number of key standards that exist in the industry. And as I said, we have a number of KPIs for all our funds, varying from whether it's the megawatt installed capacity, operational capacity, electricity generated, electricity saved through energy efficiency measures, which then translate to tons of CO2 reduced, number of beneficiaries. And then we look on another side, more from the policy side, how our projects align with the nationally determined contributions of the countries, and generally with national energy or climate policy, as well as financing, how much additional finance the project we finance mobilize, whether it's private or public funding that goes into this.
Okay, all right. Scott and Siddhant and Tamar, if you want to offer any comments, I'd be interested to know what frameworks that you might be using. Laura talked about standards. Which ones are you referencing specifically?
Well, we normally use the IFC's 8 ESG performance standards. And performance standard number 3 is relevant to this discussion, which talks about technologies to provide energy efficiency use and lowering of greenhouse gases. So we use that matrix to quantify our impact.
Okay, Scott?
No, great question. And so we are, I guess, a shout out to Jin in regards to the resources that they provide in regards to the measurements, but then also TCFD, and then we're also working with GRESB as well.
Okay. Now, Scott, I'm going to stay with you for a minute because you mentioned SFDR a little earlier in our discussion on the EU taxonomy specifically. But I know you obviously dealing with it in terms of some of these regulations that are coming down the track. Laura and Siddhant, are you experiencing similar kinds of things that you're having to take into account with regard to the EU taxonomy and SFDR in particular?
Not us.
Not us. And why is that, Siddhant? Is it because of where your capital is coming from?
I think so, and because I don't think Nepal is a signatory to that either.
Yeah.
But
okay.
we're not mandated to do that, no.
Okay. Laura, are you experiencing a similar?
Yes, we are. So as I said, we have our own kind of method we developed last year, and in this process we reviewed the different kind of frameworks that exist, and the EU taxonomy was at that point still under development, but it was clear that it will shape the way of reporting happens. I think I mentioned, forgot to mention earlier, so the other standards we align with, we always use IRIS metrics, then we use the we align with sustainable development goals. We align with the Global Compact principles, the PRI. So basically went through a matrix assessment of the different indicators. Everybody has a little bit different name, but most of them are same. And this is how we ended up with our key metrics. I mean, it extends to beyond measuring impact, positive impact, it then extends to obviously to your governance issues and ESG issues in general.
Sure. And I love the story around IRIS Plus, is that it's often a really good starting point and a way to harmonize sometimes across a number of the complex frameworks that you all have to deal with. Tamar, in your association, what frameworks are Brazilian actors using to measure their impact? Can you hear us, Tamar?
Yeah, so here we all, can you hear me?
Yes.
My connection is not good today, I'm really sorry. So we also are compatible, and we are generating credits from the Clean Development Mechanism, but we have a program that is specific to biofuels, to the transportation sector, and it's really similar to the low carbon fuel standard in California, as I mentioned. So there is a calculation on carbon footprints of these biofuels, and we are on the way to having a carbon credit program in Brazil right now. We are discussing to have similar to the ETS, to have a carbon market here in Brazil. This is being discussed, and it's really close to being put. So we are really optimistic with that. It would be really important for us to have all these regulated, and especially the methodologies that are being put, that they should be valid and compatible with all the other programs in the world.
Okay. Fantastic. And just to give up my panelists a little bit of a heads up is that I'm going to just stick on the policy side of it a little bit, but then I've got a great question on some of the other risks that you might want, that you see. So let that ruminate for a little bit. Siddhant and Laura, how do you collaborate with policymakers in your particular geographies, and how can you give some examples of how policy decisions have impacted your investment goals? Laura, maybe I can start with you. You touched on this a little bit in your last question, so perhaps you can deepen that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So we do quite a lot of policy review, obviously very important for the investments in terms of whether renewable energy policies or feed-in tariffs and so on are. In the REP website, the Renewable Energy Performance Platform website, there is also publicly available the recent alignment with it with sub-Saharan countries where our investments are in terms of climate and energy policy. We mainly act through our developer companies. So the direct, so to say, involvement with country governments, so the engagement is limited. So it's more through projects and project-related issues. In terms of obviously the tariff regulation or any changes in tariff influence our investment decisions. So perhaps that's to start with.
So you, I mean, you've got a kind of complex thing of multiple countries that you're dealing with, all sorts of different regulations that you're having to take into account to be compliant. Am I correct about that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just as a quick, for our audience, how many countries are you working in Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment?
I think we have active investment in 16 countries currently.
Okay. So there's quite a diversity there. Yeah. All right. Okay. Sedant, how are you working? Oh, sorry, Laura, go ahead.
One last point came to my mind. I mean, we do obviously have some kind of government engagement, more direct, which is through our Green Climate Fund accreditation. So I don't know if some of the listeners or participants are familiar with the Green Climate Fund, but this is kind of it's climate funding towards the renewable energy and adaptation, but that process needs to be aligned with the country policy very strongly. So the countries need to kind of promote the project. So through this aspect, there is an engagement.
Okay. All right, I'm going to just take one last question, which I alerted you to a little bit earlier, is that we've touched a little bit on the risks that are related to some of your investments, displacing workers, for example, and enabling policy environments. From an investment standpoint, are there any other major risks that you see in the transition to a low carbon environment or clean air future that you could highlight? And I don't mind who wants to go. Or is it a no-risk environment, and we put it that way?
I'm happy to start, maybe.
Okay, go for it, Laura.
I think where, as I indicated earlier, as with any infrastructure project, there is environmental risk, there's social risk related to. And I mentioned that we manage them through our environmental social management system. So all the investee companies are required to develop an IFC performance standard aligned system. But the key risks are, I mean, ensuring that where the location of the renewable energy power plant is, that it does not further endanger any endangered species or flora, fauna. Waste management is very important in the solar sector, in the battery sector. And the third, I would say, as in general in construction, occupational health and safety, how to ensure that
that's a beautiful summary, and Laura, thank you for highlighting those. Scott and Sedant, any particular risks other than those that have been mentioned that you see?
Well, let's say the biogas or biofertilizer companies that we've invested in are hugely reliant on the supply chain of those raw materials. We have to be very careful that those raw materials are organic. And sometimes if there's no monitoring in that front, then it can be a huge problem at the end, because you will create a lot of disruptions from the demand side, and that could be a reputational risk. Okay,
fantastic. Scott, any things that you see in respect of the risks that you might identify?
Yeah, Laura did a fantastic job. I was going to comment, workplace health and safety is also something we take very seriously. Policy risk is also one, but honestly, is the more that we see hardware drop, the cost of that hardware drop, the less of an impact that's going to be, quite frankly.
Okay, that's fantastic. And policy, you mean changing policy in particular?
Changing policy, but yeah. If anything, I see policy going more towards in our favor, so to speak. Of course, there's going to be a carbon tax at some point. That's only going to drive even more investment into this space.
Okay, it's great to see that divergence, that as it becomes much more efficient, the policy then starts working to drive. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's really great. Okay, one last question, just to as a popcorn round for all of the panelists in particular. All of you have had significant experience in this field. What's the one lesson that you've learned from your investments so far that has been most valuable to you? Sedant, do you want to kick off?
Yes, I think we are in a very revolutionary period here, especially when it comes to renewable energy, and I can gladly say that we've been able to invest in Nepal's largest biogas and biofertilizer company. as well as Nepal's first bio pellet company that eventually will displace coal. Hopefully, but but this is small numbers. But the learning is awareness, is to drive the awareness that you can have the same calorific content as coal with the right sort of technology. So, it is a work in progress, but we're starting small. But the lessons learned here is that it is doable and it can help the environment.
Okay, fantastic. Tamar, what's one of the biggest lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, I would say that is, as you have mentioned a lot, it's a transition, and it's not easy to be done. It requires a lot of work, public policies, the regulations is much more slower than the market, right? We have some important examples here. The market is really dynamic, but the public policies and the regulation is slow. It requires a lot of dealing, a lot of awareness, and the construction of how it is going to work. So it's not a simple way of doing that. There is no specific solution to all of the countries. It needs to consider the specificities. So it's something that it takes a lot of time to be constructed, but I think we are on the right way. So this transition is happening, and we see that.
All right. Scott and Laura, I'm not going to get to you with lessons specifically, and I'm sorry about that, but I just want to round out a little bit. And thank you all. You've been really fantastic. It really does help us to see that there are viable solutions. There are certainly the challenges, and I see that. And but some of the work that you're doing in the face of overwhelming odds is really laudable. I'd like to end with a quote from Nelson Mandela that also references my African roots. He said, and I dream of vast deserts and the forests and all of the wilderness of our continent, wild places that we should protect as a precious heritage for all our children and for our children's children. We must never forget that it is our duty to protect this environment. Knowing something of our Madiba, he too argued for finding solutions that include all on this earth. And with that, I say thank you very much to you, Laura, Siddhant, Scott, and Tamar. And to all of our wonderful audience, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Please do use the link